Well, ladies and gentlemen, let's get pump some energy in this house, and let's welcome on stage. We have Ricky Cage joining us here on stage, and this conversation will be heralded with Times Now's managing editor, Zaka Jacob. Ladies and gentlemen, well, it's the best of the evening that's coming up, so please put your hands together for Ricky Cage. Zaka, over to you.
Thank you, Ricky. You're the final act. So,
Lots of pressure.
Yeah. So you're the climax of the Sustainability Summit. Let me start with, how your journey began, because for a large part of your career, the initial years of your career, you were really making commercial music, or you were making music for commercial reasons. How did the switch happen from musician who was making jingles for advertisements to someone who's now making music for the environment?
So, as you said, I started off my career making music for commercials for television and radio, and I was making commercials for pretty much every brand you can possibly imagine and a competitor, and in different parts of the world. I was working very hard doing that. And then it sort of struck me after doing that for about 13 years that these big brands have understood, the power of music. Because music is a very powerful language, not just for communicating a message, but for retaining that message deep in the head of a listener. Every nation has got a national anthem. And the moment you listen to the first few seconds of the national anthem, you immediately feel a sense of pride for your nation. Every religion has got songs, and the moment you listen to the songs, you feel a sense of responsibility towards the God that you pray to. So music is very powerful, and these big brands understood the power of music, that they could sell products or services, through the medium of music. And so I felt that, that I feel strongly about so many different topics, especially when it comes to the environment, when it comes to sustainability, comes to positive social impact. And then I felt that, okay, as a musician, maybe I should be creating music based on topics that I feel dearly about and topics that I want to communicate to my audiences. So that's what started the first step of that particular journey, that I decided that I'm going to create music based on things that I want to communicate. But then, of course, the second step, as you know, Zaka, is that the second step happened, in 2015, when I won my first Grammy Award for an album which was based on sustainability and on peace and sustainability. So I met the Honorable Prime Minister after winning the award, and the Honorable Prime Minister saw how passionate I was about the environment and about mitigating the effects of climate change and about sustainability and all of that stuff. And then that is when he actually inspired me that, why don't you just stop everything and just focus on making music on the topics that are dear to you. And that is the plunge that I took after that, where I decided that every piece of music that I create is going to be about topics that are dear to me, which ended up being mostly about the environment.
So Prime Minister Modi is the one who inspired you to make environmental music, or music for the planet, as it were.
Yeah, he was my career guidance counselor, yeah.
But tell me, Ricky, now that you've been doing this for about 10 years now, you've won 3 Grammy Awards, you've played at the UN, you're a Goodwill Ambassador for the United Nations. From using music as an instrument of change to actually moving people to take action, how has that transition happened? Do you think that transition has happened well? Is music now a vehicle to get people to change their behavior, understand climate and the risks of climate change, and therefore take action to mitigate it?
Yeah, there are many aspects to this, and this can be quantified in many ways. So I'll give you a few examples. One is that, of course, that, to have any kind of a movement to work effectively, you have to have a top-down approach and you have to have a ground-up approach. So that's how I approach my music. I do concerts to world leaders at the UN, or to CEOs of Fortune 500 companies in intimate settings. So I do all of these kind of concerts where my messaging when it comes to my music is about what can you do as a person who can affect massive change. And the second kind of messaging is a ground-up approach when I do concerts at festivals or international audiences. Sometimes the audiences are 20,000, 50,000 people in a stadium. So there it is all about individual action as to what can we do, and also encouraging everybody that they are significant enough to make change. They're not insignificant, where, the incremental changes that they make within their own lives actually matter, and that's what I try to message through my concerts. So So there have been moments where I've actually inspired other musicians. Now, in 2020, I first collaborated with a musician in America, a person called Stuart Copeland. For those of you who do not know him, he's a 7-time Grammy Award winner. Also, he's considered to be the greatest drummer in the history of music. So that's how multiple publications have called him, and also composed music for Oscar-winning soundtracks. So I collaborated with him on an album which was about the environment, and he loved it. And until then, he used to bother about the environment, but his music would not reflect that. And his very next album that he created was an album called Wild Concerto, which I also collaborated with him in some small way in that particular album. But he created a whole album based on his inspiration for creating change for the environment. And that album went on to becoming very successful all over the world. And in addition to that, when it comes to world leaders, like in 2015 at the Climate Change Conference in Paris, every world leader had to come up on stage and give a speech, and most world leaders gave speeches which are about 10 or 15 minutes. There was one particular world leader from the Republic of Kiribati, a Pacific island nation. He went up on stage and gave a speech which was just 30 seconds. He just went up on stage and he said that I come from the Pacific island nation of Kiribati. Please pass a resolution, all you 195 countries, please pass a resolution that ensures that my people of Kiribati stay above the water. That's all he said, and he walked off stage. So I visited Kiribati. I made some music with their president, made some music with their people, and I've been performing that at every international, intergovernmental, concert that I've been able to do. I've performed it 3 times now at the UN headquarters in New York, twice in Geneva, everywhere in the world. And now there has been a lot of international recognition for the disastrous fate that Kiribati is about to have, because according to the Intergovernmental Panel, they are predicted to be the first country in the world that's going to go completely underwater due to climate change. They've got 21 inhabited islands, very low-lying islands. They used to have 33, now they have 21. So they are a very good example to showcase that climate change is not some vague phenomenon that may or may not happen in the future. It is happening right now. There are current victims of climate change. And the people who are the greatest victims of climate change, like Kiribati, are the ones who are not at all responsible for climate change.
So tell us about, as far as India's journey is concerned, and many people, say this, whether it's about our sustainable action journey or even our music in that sense, and you have been a good example of this, that India has to go back to its roots. Sustainable climate action is not something alien to us. We've been doing this for generations, for centuries. But how do you marry, let's say modern day science or modern day practices and revive some of our old practices which have always kept nature front and center of our thinking?
No, absolutely. So when it comes to our traditional Indian music, we always talk about Indian classical forms of music, that is Hindustani classical, Carnatic classical, Dhrupad, all of that, Khayal. Now, the thing is that there is music that actually predates that, which is the folk and the tribal forms of music. Some of these musical forms are said to be, or some of these songs are said to be more than 3,000 years old. And these songs have been passed down orally from generation to generation. So there's very little documentation on it. So for the last about 8 years, actually 10 years, I've been traveling the length and breadth of India with a crew, and I've been trying to document these songs because these songs are on the threat of extinction, because the newer generation are not, practicing these musical forms. And the best part is that a lot of these tribal people who actually sing these songs are farmers. And they sing about coexistence with the environment. They sing about the good things in life. They sing about being one with nature, about maintaining this delicate balance of ecosystems. And this is a wealth of knowledge that can actually be taught through music. And that's what I've been trying to do, trying to bring this to the forefront. Slowly but surely, I've been trying to do that. And the thing is that when it comes to the principles of the environment and the principles of mitigating the effects of climate change and of responsible living, that has not changed for many, many centuries and many millennia. That's absolutely not changed. And you could be on any aisle of the political spectrum, but these principles of living responsibly with the planet will apply, and pretty much everybody will agree to these principles of living responsibly. So I believe that there's a wealth of knowledge that one can learn from these ancient forms of music, and I hope to bring this to the forefront.
So one good thing about Ricky is he's just not, coming here and giving lectures and sermonizing. He actually practices in his daily life, climate action. So one of the things you do, I believe, is measuring your own carbon footprint over, you do it what, once every quarter?
Once every quarter, yeah.
How do you do this? And how can people, learn from, let's say, your example?
So there are a lot of firms that actually do this, because of course I travel internationally and I do concerts. All of this has got a large carbon footprint, unfortunately. So what I do is that I get my carbon footprint audited every quarter, just like how we get our finances audited. And everything from my ink usage to my electricity usage to my air travel, my ground transportation, everything. And that is put to a number. And then what I do is that I have a meeting with my team and with the people who are auditing me. And we figure out how do we reduce our carbon footprint and what measures can we take to reduce my carbon footprint for the next quarter. And what we do is that whatever number we arrive at, we mitigate that. Of course, mitigation is not the answer. But it just helps me sleep better at night. So that's why we mitigate my carbon footprint through tree plantations and investment in renewable energy companies. So that's one of the things that I do.
So tell me a little bit more about that, particularly given your profession and you travel so much. You were just telling me off stage, you visited 14 countries this year alone. That's a lot of carbon footprint. So how do you balance that? How do you balance the demands of your job with your responsibility to, take action against climate change?
So that's always a challenge because one cannot help but feel that, I myself am a hypocrite when it comes to this. And that is something that I have to live with. But at the same time, what I do is that even though it seems that I've traveled to a lot of countries, I only do it when I'm absolutely sure and I know that this travel is essential because I feel that I can create a measurable impact in the country that I'm actually going to. And so it'll be good for the larger, for the greater good. That's what, if I can articulate it in that way. And also what I do is that I do other things to actually bring down my carbon footprint. Like one of the things, as we were discussing, is that I do not subscribe to fast fashion at all. And this is something that I say time and again. The suit that I'm wearing right now, or whenever I'm wearing any kind of a suit, if you go onto my Instagram, you'll see it in at least about 40 or 50 different events. The suit itself is about easily about 6 years old. So I buy good quality clothes and I take very good care of them, and I constantly keep re-wearing them because I believe even financially that the most expensive clothes that you ever buy are the ones that you wear only once. So that's why I've extracted the most amount of money out of my clothes possible. The second thing is that I do not own a car. I used to own 3 cars up to about 2013, and then I decided that when I travel abroad, I use public transportation, so why can't I do that in my own city and encourage other people also and lead by example by getting more people to use public transportation, and hopefully that will reach a critical mass where governments will be more and more encouraged to provide better facilities when it comes to public transportation. Then the third thing is that, of course, I have a meat-free diet, but that is something that should not be forced on people because that has got a lot of cultural and nutritional ramifications, but that's something that I do.
But, so you come from Bangalore, and it's not an easy city for traffic. What sort of public transport are you taking there in the city?
So there I use the metro because most of the places that I go to, the metro train reaches. When I have to go to the airport, if I'm not carrying too much of luggage, then I use the airport bus, which goes to the airport. And when I'm coming back from the airport, I use the airport bus very often because that's very simple. You can just catch the bus right outside the terminal. And and of course, the metro, again, I'm very fortunate that I've got a station which is about a 4 or 5 minute walk away from my house. So that's why I use the metro all the time.
So you were talking about, you reuse clothes. You're a big advocate of reusing clothes. Your Instagram feed must be very boring because in this day and age where young people are saying, you have to turn up in a different outfit every few hours and, fast fashion and smart casual and all of that, you're wearing the same damn suit.
No, but it's actually a huge advantage because today, if Times Now does not give me good photographs of this event, I can use photographs from a previous event where I was wearing the same clothes.
You just replace the logo, yeah?
Yeah, exactly. But anyway, jokes apart, I believe that we need to rewear our clothes and we need to double down on it. And that's the reason why I started this hashtag. It's called Rewear and the numeric 4 and Earth. So Rewear for Earth. So I believe that we need to wear the same clothes to multiple public events and use that hashtag and double down on it that you know, that the earth does not remember what we wore for our last party, but the earth definitely remembers how we treat it. And we should double down that we are doing this because we are being more responsible to the planet. Like, for example, I'm wearing these cotton pants and it's supposed to be sustainable material, and it is sustainable material, sustainable fashion or whatever you may call it. But at the same time, if we have to sensitize ourselves, like Times has got this thing of Times consciousness, right?
Correct.
So if you are more conscious about it, we'll realize that it takes about 14 or 15 cotton plants to actually create these cotton pants. So imagine the amount of land usage. It takes a total of 5 months to actually harvest those cotton plants. So you have to water those cotton plants for about 5 months, put in a lot of pesticides, which creates a whole lot of groundwater problems and all of that. Then once you harvest the cotton after 5 months, then you have to transport it via air or via ship to a completely different country for processing, then for dyeing, then for weaving, then a completely different country for manufacturing, and then after that it's taken via flights and planes to various countries for selling. So by the time you actually get the cotton pant in the store, it's got a water footprint, leaving aside the carbon footprint, but it's got a water footprint of 8,000 liters of water. So that's how much goes into a single cotton pant. So instead of buying, we need to buy sustainable fashion, but we need to rewear it. The most important thing is rewearing your clothes and keeping those clothes for a very long period of time and being very conscious before you decide to buy newer clothes. So just have the same clothes, wear it many, many times till the time you can't wear it again, and then probably look at buying new clothes.
So from fashion, let's come back to music, because that's your first love. That's what you're known for. So your environmental music journey started through the Winds of Samsara, then you had the Shanti Samsara series, and then of course you played at COP21. You've reached millions of people around the world. And of course, young people are very, very passionate about, mitigating against climate change and so on and so forth. But at the same time, they also have very limited attention spans. So how do you reconcile these two? You have to capture their attention, yet at the same time, they're very passionate about the causes that you stand for.
So I believe that it's said time and again that young people have got very less attention spans. But I do not believe that. It's just that sometimes they are in an environment which is not conducive to them for having a longer attention span. Like, for example, watching YouTube videos or listening to music on Spotify, because the minute you listen to a piece of music on Spotify or watch a YouTube video, there are a whole bunch of related videos which are right next there, screaming at you to be clicked on. So then you end up just watching videos for about 5 seconds or 10 seconds or scrolling on reels because you are able to do that. But then the biggest hit of this year was Dhurandhar, and it was 4 hours long. And young people thronged to the theaters and watched it and made it the biggest hit of Indian cinema. Also, the Odyssey, which is such a huge success right now, that is 3 hours long. So young people do have the attention span. It's just that they need to be in an environment which is conducive to them concentrating or being a part of a captive audience. So I believe concerts are the best way to communicate with audiences and young audiences, and that's what I do, because we have about 90 minutes or 2-hour-long concerts where we are constantly it's very entertaining concerts where all the young people are dancing, they're singing with us, they're having a great time, but at the same time, they have something to think about when they go back home.
So just in terms of your body of work, you've talked about the rising sea levels in Kiribati. You had mentioned that earlier as well. You've talked about, going against plastic pollution, against fast fashion, re-wearing clothes. You even talked about the human-elephant conflict, which is a big thing in the southern part of the country. I'm coming back to that thing about, what is the responsibility that artists, creative artists like you have when it comes to social issues? You also at sometimes get panned for not taking a stand on certain social issues. So where do you draw that line?
I think, first of all, it's extremely important for artists to sensitize themselves to the issues at hand, and rather than having just a surface level information or being like a general purpose spokesperson for every single issue that possibly exists on the planet. So when I started off my career in so-called activism, but now I call myself an advocate rather than an activist. When I started my career, I was just like any other very aggressive activist, where, ban this or ban that, you're being immoral, how dare you do this, and, and just being very aggressively against pretty much everybody. And then as I grew a little older, and hopefully I grew a little wiser, I travel the length and breadth of India, length and breadth of the global south, especially continental Africa, Southeast Asia, South America. And this realization dawned on me that in this whole world, there are only two kinds of problems, okay? You can put every problem into two major buckets. A problem of survival and a problem of thriving, you know? So when it comes to the global north, that is the developed world, you know, survival is sort of taken care of because everybody has got access to food, to some kind of shelter. People can flick on a switch and a light turns on, and there is access to electricity, sanitation. But then when it comes to the global south, survival itself survival itself is looked upon as an everyday struggle, and thriving is looked upon as an unimaginable luxury. You know, because we have to care more about poverty, about hunger, about malnutrition, education, sanitation, gender inequality, gender violence, all of these topics before we can actually move towards thriving. And unfortunately, the environment and climate change is looked upon more as a problem of thriving rather than a problem of survival. And I also realized that the narratives in the West do not work for India. Like, for example, in the West, it's commonly said that, we need to consume less of everything. Now, if you go to a village in the global south, which is in abject poverty, and you go and meet a patriarch of a family, and you tell that particular person that, you know, we need to consume less of everything to make this world a better place, they're just going to turn around and say that, I don't have much to consume in the first place. What are you talking about? Or the other narrative of we need to build a better future for our future generations. Of course, we need to build a better future for our future generations. And I also say that time and again. But if you tell that same patriarch of that family that we need to build a better future for our future generations, they're going to be like, what about my generation? I don't have electricity. I don't have sanitation. I don't have access to running water. You can't skip my generation while you're figuring out this whole renewable thing. So basically, I started realizing that if one wants to be an environmentalist, you need to draw people in rather than push people away. And you need to work with everybody, and you need to have a holistic view towards problem solving. And that's the only way we can solve the climate crisis and we can solve the environmental crisis. If we work with everybody, have a strong sense of empathy, and understand that everybody needs to move ahead together, and everybody's got dreams and aspirations.
You know, it's interesting you say that because you're right. You know, climate change and action against climate change was thought of as a rich man's problem. It's the developed world's problem, so on and so forth. But now you're seeing sort of opposite narratives, right? In the global north, you are having leaders who are climate deniers, who are basically saying that climate change is a hoax. And here in the global south, I mean, you heard the minister earlier today saying that we are reaching almost 300 gigawatts of renewable energy, perhaps in the next few weeks. And we're on course to meeting 500 gigawatts by the end of the decade. So countries in the global south, like India, countries in Africa, etc., have become advocates and champions of action against climate change, whereas the original folks have now become climate deniers.
So I think it is a myth that there are a lot of politicians and lots of global leaders who are climate deniers. They are only in one country, and that is the United States.
Okay.
Because everywhere in the world, climate change is looked upon as a scientific consensus, and it's science. You know, climate change is science at the end of the day. It's only in America where climate change is looked upon more like a religion, that you can believe in climate change or you cannot believe in climate change, you know. So that is the difference between the United States and any other country. And also, countries like India and most of the countries in the global south have an ancient culture. And this ancient culture has always taught us to live in coexistence with the environment. Like if you look at Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, it's constantly thrown around everywhere, and it was also the motto of our G20, G20, when we hosted the G20 in India. Now, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, right now, the only thing that comes to our mind when we think about it, or coexistence, is that living in peace and harmony among all of us human beings. But actually, if you look at the Upanishads, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam has always meant living in absolute peace and absolute harmony with with all life. That is not just human beings, but also the forests and the wildlife. And not only that, also with the elements of nature, the land we walk on, the air we breathe, the water we drink. So I guess for us to understand that climate change is a problem is easier for us to imbibe, and also for us to understand the urgency of solutions. I think for ancient cultures, it's a lot easier. And also, the most important thing is that we are not at fault at climate change, you know. So we understand, rather the Western nations and the global north, the developed world, they've also got a lot of guilt, and I guess that's the reason why sometimes it's inconvenient for them to admit that climate change is a reality.
So finally, as I come to the conclusion of this short chat that we had, you've been a multi-time Grammy Award winner. You've won the Ban Ki-moon Award. You've been honored at the United Nations General Assembly. You've won a Padma Award. Which of these you reckon is most precious to Ricky Cage?
For me, I think 100% by a huge margin, it's the Padma Shri Award. Because, to be recognized by our own country after being recognized all over the world, I think there is no feeling that can, that can come up to that, that can match to that. Also, to be in the Rashtrapati Bhavan, to get the award from the Honorable, from Her Excellency, the President of India, and in the presence of Prime Minister Modi, I think it was absolutely amazing. And the whole ceremony was absolutely beautiful because there was an incident that happened over there, which I'll quickly tell you that, after you win the Padma Award, all the winners assemble in one particular hall, and all the family members assemble in another hall. So then Prime Minister Modi goes and visits all the family members first, and then he comes and visits the award winners. So when he finished off visiting the family members, he walked into the hall where all of us were assembled, and he walked straight to me, and I've got this photograph on my Instagram, and he holds my hand with both his hands, and he's like, तेरी मम्मी मिली मुझे वहां पर, and वो चिल्ला कर बोल रही थी कि मैं रिकी की माँ हूँ. So then I told him that, that I'm sorry about that. That he's like, no, ऐसा ही गर्व होना चाहिए माता पिता को अपने बेटे पर. And he's like, I'm really happy that you won, and I'm very happy for your parents. So it was a beautiful moment for me. And so all of these things put together, I think that the Padma Shri, I think without a doubt, is something that I will cherish most.
All right. As we round up, we're going to request Ricky to play one of your compositions. You can talk about it, and then you can tell us, the significance of it, how it came about, and of course, we'll end on that note.